we look at the letters in the New Testament that were written to early churches, we actually can see quite a bit of what was going on in those churches and in their services. In some cases, it is not always explained entirely in full detail, but the explanations given, we can see were understood by the people who received the epistle or the letter from the apostle. Like, for example, in Ephesians and Colossians, both, the apostle Paul reminds them to sing to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, warning and teaching one another and making melody in their hearts to the Lord. Now, I think I just consolidated both of those verses into a single paraphrase from Colossians and Ephesians. But the thing is, the people who received the letter from the apostle, they understood what he was talking about. And in our case, we do have a gap of time between today and 2011 and the days of the apostles. So, we have to, understand we don't always have the whole picture, but if we look at everything that is said, we may be able to still infer what was the whole picture to those people in the New Testament apostolic churches. So, if we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and this situation is very interesting. And the reason why is because the Apostle Paul, if you remember from the book of Acts, came to Corinth. He came with the vision. The Lord stood by him in the night and said, "Don't be afraid to speak. I have many people in this city." And the Apostle Paul, he preached the gospel, starting in synagogue, and he got kicked out. And he opened up, I think, next door in Jason's house. And he preached the gospel and founded and brought forth the church at Corinth. And he was there for about a year and a half. And after a year and a half of ministering at Corinth and in the church and preaching the gospel, the Lord sent Apostle Paul on. But Apollos came in, and Apollos took over the work of the ministry at Corinth. And Apollos did that by teaching the church. And so the Apostle Paul says, "I planted and another watered, but God gives the increase." Paul, as the evangelist, planted by laying the foundation, who is Jesus Christ. He explains that. And after he leaves, Apollos takes over the work of the ministry, and Apollos waters by teaching in the church. Now, at Corinth, they eventually, as years passed, they began to have some problems. So somebody at Corinth, maybe someone from Phoebe's house, sent a letter back to the Apostle Paul and explained, hey, we're having some problems. Could you please clear this up? And so the Apostle Paul writes several epistles, and one of them that we have is 1 Corinthians. And so in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, he says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." Then he says, "I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you." Now, Paul, he didn't say he gave them Paul's traditions. No, he said follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. I praise you for remembering me in everything, for holding to the traditions, just as I pass them on to you. And in the earlier part of the epistle, I think around verse 6, the Apostle Paul says, my ways in Christ, which I teach everywhere and in every church. He said he would send Timothy, who would remind them of his ways in Christ that he teaches everywhere and in every... Now, when Paul says everywhere and in every church, what churches is he talking about? Well, by the time the Apostle Paul reached Corinth, Paul had been very, very active in creating, founding, forming, nurturing, supporting many churches. Antioch, he was there for years before the Lord sent him out on his first apostolic mission. Crete, he had Titus overseeing Crete. Ephesus, he was in Ephesus for years. Macedonia, Galatia, Lystra, Derbe, Thessalonica, Philippi, Galatia. So Paul had a pretty big track record in the churches. And of course, everything that Paul taught was in accord with what the apostles at Jerusalem also were teaching. And the Apostle Paul and the apostles from Jerusalem made some effort to make sure they're on the same page, so that, Paul would not be saying one thing and Peter saying something else. And so when Paul made the trip back to Jerusalem to see Peter for 15 days, we can see they corresponded about, what they're preaching. And if you think about this, the Apostle Paul was plagued with problems that came from the unbelieving Jews. You can see that all over in the book of Acts. And there were people who took the things that Paul said and twisted what he taught and attempted to misrepresent his words. So, it's not hard to imagine that when Paul put something into writing and put his name or his stamp on it, probably he had a copy made, or copies, and sent it back to Jerusalem at some point to the other leaders of the church. That way, when people tried to say, oh, we have this letter and this is what the apostle said, and they misrepresented or fabricated whatever, that they were trying to put forth, people in the church at large, or leaders in the church at large, could look at it and say, no, that's not what Paul teaches. Peter, in fact, if you read Peter's own words, he refers to the things that are difficult and hard to understand that Paul wrote. And Peter says that men have taken these things and twisted them to their own destruction, as they do all the scriptures. So Peter was aware of what Paul taught. And Paul, more than likely as a safeguard, had backups of whatever he wrote and circulated and sent it to other leaders to make sure everybody understood this is where he's at. And if we suppose that the original church in Jerusalem was an Aramaic-speaking church, and that Peter and the apostles, the Galileans, were speakers of Aramaic, then it's not hard to imagine that the Apostle Paul would have made a copy in their language and in the language of the Jewish people, which had been in use for centuries, when he sent his epistle back to the home church. Now, I'm not dogmatic about that, because we don't actually have clear enough records saying, yes, this is what happened. But if we look at the records we do have, and we look at the overall situation and why they had needed safeguards in place to head off false prophets and false teachers, then it wouldn't seem unreasonable to think that this would have occurred, and this would explain maybe some of the very early documents in the church in the original Aramaic tongue.